It was 6:42 in the morning, on a Tuesday. I knew the time precisely because my digital watch, a relic from my years in the field, beeped softly to mark the moment I should be checking the internal temperature of the pork shoulder. A thin, blue-white ribbon of hickory smoke was curling from the chimney of my smokehouse, carrying the scent of slow-rendering fat and seasoned bark across the damp morning air. It was a smell of patience, of process, end quote. For me, it was the smell of peace. That peace was about to be broken. Her name was Carol, and she was standing on my lawn, right at the edge of the crushed gravel path that led to my workshop. She was holding a large red 3-ring binder, clutching it to her chest like a shield. I watched her from my kitchen window, a mug of black coffee warming my hands. She hadn't seen me yet. She was staring at the smokehouse, a stout little building of cinder block and reclaimed barnwood that I had designed and built myself, with every permit pulled and every inspection passed. Her face, even from 50 feet away, was a mask of furious indignation. She was the president of our homeowners association, a position she had held for 6 consecutive one-year terms, mostly because no one else wanted the headache. She treated the neighborhood covenants, conditions, and restrictions not as a governing document, but as her personal manifesto. She took a step onto the gravel path. Then, another. Her sensible walking shoes crunched with an authority she clearly felt she possessed. I sighed, took a final sip of coffee, and set the mug down on the granite countertop. I didn't reach for my phone to record, not yet. Observation first. Documentation second. That was the process. She marched directly to the smokehouse and placed her hand on the heavy oak door, as if testing its heat. It was, of course, barely worn to the touch. It was a double-walled, insulated, professional-grade build. She had no idea. She never did. That was when I decided to make my presence known. I slid open the patio door, the rollers making a soft whirring sound in the quiet morning. I stepped out onto the dew-soaked flagstones. Can I help you?" "Carol," I asked. My voice was calm, even. It was the same voice I had used for decades in contentious municipal planning meetings. She spun around, startled. The red binder slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground, pages of bylaws and violation notices spilling onto the damp gravel. For a moment she just looked flustered, her performance thrown off script. But she recovered quickly, her face hardening again. "Arthur," she said, her voice tight and accusatory. You know exactly why I am here. This thing is a menace." I walked slowly toward her, stopping a respectful 10 feet away, my hands in the pockets of my worn flannel robe. "Aida's, a smokehouse. Carolita's been here for 3 years. We've had this conversation before." "Oh, we have," she snapped, bending to retrieve her scattered papers with jerky, angry movements. "And I have been patient. I have been neighborly. But this is a direct violation of Section 7, subsection C, regarding ancillary structures and fire hazards. I have a petition signed by 27 residents demanding its immediate removal." She straightened up, brandishing a sheet of paper. "You are to cease and desist all operations immediately. You will receive a formal notice of violation today, with a $500 fine. If this structure is not dismantled within 30 days, the fine will double, and a lien will be placed on your property." I just watched her. I let the silence hang in the air, broken only by the gentle hiss of the smoker. I knew for a fact that she didn't have 27 signatures. She might have 4, perhaps 5, from her inner circle of sycophants, who benefited from her selective enforcement of the rules. The lien threat was her favorite closer, a financial bogeyman she used to terrorize elderly residents into compliance over the color of their mailboxes. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I looked at the smokehouse. Then back at her, this structure is in full compliance with all county building codes, fire regulations, and for that matter, the HOA's own governing documents. The ones that were properly filed with the county at least. Her eyes narrowed. I am the president of this association. Arthur, I interpret the documents. This is a fire hazard, a nuisance, and it is unapproved. The Architectural Review Committee never signed off on this. I checked the records. This was the part that always fascinated me. The sheer unblinking confidence of her assertions. The belief that if she said something, it simply became true. It was a kind of superpower. I supposed, if you had no regard for reality. The plans were submitted on March 12, 2018, I said, my voice still level. They were approved by the ARC, then chaired by Mr. Henderson, before he passed away. The approval is on file with the county clerk, attached to the building permit. Permit number 74B1138. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a sneer. Henderson was old. He made mistakes. I am rectifying them. You will take this down or I will have it taken down. I will call the fire marshal myself. I will call the sheriff. Juan de Beers. Do not test me, Arthur. She turned on her heel and crunched her way back across my lawn, leaving a trail of damp footprints in the grass. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. In her mind, the verdict had been delivered. Sentence would be carried out. I stood there for a long moment, watching her retreat. The sun was just beginning to crest the tops of the pine trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of our subdivision. I looked at my smokehouse, the source of so much quiet satisfaction, now the subject of a petty tyrant's crusade. I thought about the files in my office, the years of quiet observation, the carefully catalogued receipts for fines I had paid without protest, just to establish a paper trail. I thought about the detailed property survey I had commissioned 2 years ago, the one that sat in a sealed tube waiting. I looked at the slight indentation her sensible shoes had left in my turf. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. She thought this was about a smokehouse. She had no idea it was about everything. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain how we got here. It is important to understand the foundation of things. In my line of work, you learn that the things you see on the surface of the road, the building, the argument on a Tuesday morning are just the final expression of 1,000 decisions and 100 documents buried deep underground or in a dusty county archive. To understand the crack in the pavement, you have to understand the soil composition, the compaction standards, the grade of the aggregate used in the subbase. To understand Carroll, you had to understand the last decade in the Lakeshore Point subdivision. I moved here 12 years ago with my wife Eleanor. We bought the house for its quiet cul-de-sac and the large, wooded lot that backed up to a nature preserve. I was a civil engineer, specializing in municipal, infrastructure, and zoning law. For 40 years, my world was one of blueprints, transit levels, load-bearing calculations, and public records. I read contracts and covenants for a living. I could find a fatal flaw in a 100-page zoning proposal the way a hawk spots a field mouse from 1,000 feet up. It was my job to see the structure beneath the surface. Eleanor used to say I had a blueprint for a soul. She meant it as a compliment. When she passed away 5 years ago, the quiet of the house became a louder. The hobbies that had filled my weekends became the structure of my days. Woodworking, gardening, and barbecue. Specifically, traditional low and slow smoking. It was a process. It required patience, precision, and an understanding of the materials. It suited me. The smokehouse was the culmination of that hobby. It was my retirement project. I spent 6 months on the design alone, ensuring it was not only functional, but aesthetically pleasing, built with materials that complemented our home and the natural surroundings. I researched every relevant county ordinance, and yes, the HOA governing documents. The covenants were surprisingly vague on outbuildings, a common oversight in developments of this age. They required ARC approval, which I sought and received in writing. I pulled the permits, I had the concrete pad inspected before the pour, I had the wiring inspected before closing up the walls, I had the final structure inspected and signed off on. On paper, my little smokehouse was more legally sound than some of the houses in the neighborhood. I kept every document, every receipt, every blueprint. I kept them in a gray, fire-resistant file box in my home office. It was just habit. Carol moved in about 2 years after Eleanor and I did. She was a whirlwind of manicured energy and pronouncements. She joined the HOA board within a year, and a year after that, she was president. Her husband was a perpetually silent man, who seemed to exist only to nod in agreement during her tirades at the annual meetings. At first, her reign was one of minor annoyances. She instituted a rule, not found anywhere in the covenants, that all trash cans had to be a specific shade of beige, purchased from a specific online retailer. She sent violation notices for blades of grass that were a 1/4 inch too high. She measured the distance between flowers and people as garden beds. Most people, myself included, found it easier to just comply. We paid the $25 fines. We bought the beige trash cans. It was easier than fighting. It was the tax we paid for a quiet life. But after Eleanor died, I started noticing the cruelty that underpinned Cola's obsession with control." End quote. She fined old Mr. Abernathy, a widower on a fixed income, $200 because his oak tree dropped leaves onto the common area sidewalk. He spent a whole weekend trying to sweep them up as they fell, a frail old man fighting a losing battle with autumn. She tried to force the Millers, a young couple with a disabled child, to tear down a small wooden ramp they had built for their Sona's wheelchair, because it wasn't made of the approved composite decking material. That was the first time I intervened, quietly. I sent the board a politely worded email, citing the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, with links to the relevant federal statutes. The issue was dropped without another word. Carol never acknowledged my email, but she stopped speaking to me at the mailbox. I took that as a victory. That was when I started a new file. It wasn't my Smokehouse file box. This was a simple, manila folder. I labeled it HOA Correspondence. Every violation notice. Every newsletter filled with her passive-aggressive reminders. Every email it all went into the folder. When I saw her berating a contractor for parking his truck on the street instead of a driveway, I would make a note of the date and time. When I heard her telling Mrs. Gable that her wind chimes were a sonic nuisance and violated a rule that didn't exist, I added it to the log. I wasn't planning anything. It was just what I did. I gathered data. I documented. I kept the receipts. For an engineer, data is comfort. It's the solid ground beneath your feet. Over 4 years, that single manila folder grew into a thick, bulging accordion file. Then into 2. It was a meticulous, cross-referenced history of petty tyranny, a blueprint of a bully. The dispute over the smokehouse had started small. A comment in passing about the unpleasant odor, an anonymous note in my mailbox about property values. Then came the first official-looking letter, printed on cheap letterhead shade designed herself, citing non-existent rules. I had responded with a polite, formal letter of my own, referencing the specific sections of the covenants that permitted the structure and attaching a copy of the ARC approval form from 2018. I sent it via certified mail. I kept the delivery confirmation receipt. That, of course, went into the file. She had no idea that her every move was being entered into a ledger. She believed she was operating in a world of her own making, governed by her own rules. And for the most part she was right. Most people folded under the pressure. They didn't have the time, the energy, or the inclination to read a 60-page legal document, to fight a $50 fine for having the wrong kind of mulch. But I did. My time was my own. My energy was focused, and reading 60-page legal documents was, for me, a way of life. The smokehouse was not the real issue. It was just the piece of ground she had chosen for her last stand. And I, a man who had spent his life surveying and securing ground, was more than prepared to meet her there on paper. After Carola's performance on my lawn, I went back inside, washed my coffee mug, and placed it in the dishwasher. I checked the temperature probes in the pork shoulder 163 degrees Fahrenheit, right on schedule for the stall. I wrapped it tightly in butcher paper, returned it to the smoker, and closed the heavy oak door. The process could not be rushed, neither could this. I went to my office, a room lined with bookshelves filled with engineering texts, survey maps, and binders of old project files. I sat down at my large oak desk, the surface clean and organized except for a single pen and a yellow legal pad. I pulled the two thick accordion files labeled HHO from the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and placed them squarely in the center of the desk. The first thing I did was draft a letter, not to Carol, but to the HOA Board of Directors, care of their registered agent, which was a law firm downtown. Contacting Carol directly was pointless. It would only be met with bluster and dismissal. The process required a formal record. My letter was brief and professional. It detailed the encounter that morning, quoting her threats of fines and a property lien verbatim. It stated that my structure was in full compliance, referenced the permit number and the 2018 ARC approval, and attached copies of both. It then formally requested that the board provide within 10 business days, as stipulated in the bylaws, the specific, cited covenant violation that justified her actions. It respectfully informed them that any attempt to levy fines or place a lien on my property without proper due process and a valid, documented violation would be met with immediate legal action, for which I would seek to recover all associated costs. I printed 3 copies, one for the letter, one for my files, and one for my lawyer. I drove to the post office and sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. The green and white slip, once it was returned with a signature, would be another brick in the wall of evidence I was constructing. It was a simple, procedural step, but a critical one. It moved the conflict from a shouting match on a lawn to an official, documented exchange. It forced them onto the field of paper, my home turf. Next, I called Mark. Mark had been my protege at the engineering firm before I retired. He was sharp, ambitious, and had an almost religious reverence for the sanctity of a properly filed plat map. He owed me a few favors, and more than that, he enjoyed this kind of puzzle. "Marka," I said when he answered. "Arthur? I have a small project for you, pro bono, but it might be fun." I explained the situation. He chuckled. "An HOA, president on a power trip, Arthur. That is like Tuesday for half our clients. What do you need?" "I need a full title search on my property. Going back to the original subdivision plat filed in 1988, I want to know about every easement, every right-of-way, every recorded covenant that touches my parcel. I have the survey I commissioned a couple of years back, but I want the official county records to back it up. I also want you to pull the full, original incorporation documents for the Lakeshore Point Homeowners Association. Not the amended bylaws, they post on their website, the ones filed with the state are looking for a discrepancy." Ark asked, his voice already sounding intrigued. "Looking for the truth," I said, "on paper." Carol claims the ARC records don't show my approval. I want to see if we can subpoena the complete ARC records for the last 10 years. I have a feeling my file is the only one that ta's gone missing. When it ta's convenient, I'll get my paralegal on it, Mark said. She lives for this stuff. I'll have the preliminary documents for you by the end of the week. With the official channels in motion, I turned my attention to the more immediate threat. Carol had said she would call the fire marshal. I decided to preempt her. I looked up the non-emergency number for the county fire department and called the Fire Prevention Bureau. I spoke to a very helpful captain and explained the situation. I described my smoker in detail. The double-walled cinder block construction, the steel-lined firebox, the insulated chimney with its spark arrestor, its distance from my home and any other flammable structures. I gave him the permit number and the dates of the final inspection. Frankly, Captain, I said, I am more concerned about the HOA president harassing me than I am about any fire risk. But she has threatened to call you, and I wanted to make sure you had the facts on record from me directly, before you get a hysterical call about a 5-alarm fire in my backyard. The captain was professional, but I could hear a note of weary amusement in his voice. Sir, we get calls like this all the time. Based on your description and the fact that you have a past final inspection, you have nothing to worry about. If we are dispatched, we have to respond. But an inspector will likely just take a look, confirm it matches the permit, and be on their way. Thank you for calling ahead. It helps. This was another small, procedural act, but it laid a foundation. Persenra. It established me as a reasonable, proactive, safety-conscious citizen. It framed Carola's future call, not as a legitimate safety concern, but as a nuisance. Every action was a data point. Every data point contributed to the final picture. A week later, the certified letter receipt came back, signed by a paralegal at the HOA's law firm. The 10 business days began to count down. On the 8th day, Mark called. Hey Arthur, you're not going to believe this, he said, and the excitement in his voice was palpable. I have got the original subdivision plat map from 1988, the big one, the master plan. Your lot is interesting. How so? I asked, leaning forward in my chair. When the developer laid out the subdivision, they had to account for a primary storm drain that runs along the back of that whole row of houses. There's a 10-foot utility and drainage easement running along the back property line of every lot on your side of the street. It is for county access to maintain the storm drain. It is right there on the plat, clear as day. I knew about the easement. It was standard practice. Okay, I said. And your smokehouse, Mark said. And I could hear him rustling papers. Is not in the easement. It's close, but you built it about 3 feet inside your actual property line, leaving the easement completely clear. You probably did it instinctively. He was right. I'd seen the easement on my own survey and wouldn't have dreamed of building on it. But here's the kicker, he continued. I pulled the HOA's landscape plans for the beautification project. They did 5 years ago, the one where they planted all those crepe myrtles behind the houses. I remembered it. Carol's pet project. Shade sent out a dozen newsletters about it. Arthur, Mark said, his voice dropping slightly. They planted those trees and installed a sprinkler system for them, directly in the middle of the county's utility easement. All of them for the entire length of the street. The HOA, under Carol's direction, effectively encroached on and obstructed a public right-of-way. I was silent for a moment, processing the information. The sheer, beautiful, procedural irony of it. Carol, the woman obsessed with rules and regulations, had directed the HOA to commit a significant and ongoing zoning violation. A violation that could carry substantial fines from the county and require the complete removal of dozens of mature trees at the HOA's expense. She had no idea, I murmured. She had no idea, Mark confirmed. She was so busy measuring her neighbor's grass that she never bothered to check the master plan for her own project. I kept the receipts. Arthur, I have got the signed contract with the landscape company approved by her. I've got the payment records from the OAA's own budget. On paper, Shay's completely, utterly exposed. This was it. This was the bombshell. My little smokehouse dispute had just uncovered a foundational error, a crack in the very ground on which Carol had built her tiny kingdom. She had picked a fight with a civil engineer over a zoning issue, and in doing so, had led me directly to her own, far greater transgression. I sat back in my chair, the phone warm against my ear. The pork shoulder had been delicious, but this felt even better. This was the slow, satisfying rendering of fact. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, it happened. I was in the backyard tending to my vegetable garden, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a large diesel engine rumbling down our quiet residential street. I straightened up, wiping the soil from my hands onto my jeans, and looked toward the front of the house. A massive, gleaming red fire engine was pulling to a stop directly in front of my driveway. The cavalry had arrived, just as Carol had promised. She was already out on her lawn across the street, arms crossed, wearing a look of profound vindication. A few other neighbors, her usual court of supporters, were drifting out of their homes, drawn by the spectacle. This was exactly what she wanted, a public display of authority, a validation of her power. She had called in the heavy machinery to put the quiet man in his place. 2 firefighters in full turnout gear hopped down from the truck. A third wearing a white helmet and a blue uniform shirt that indicated a command rank emerged from the passenger side. He was the fire chief. He was tall, with graying hair and a calm professional demeanor that seemed utterly at odds with the suburban drama unfolding around him. He looked at my house, then at Carol, then back at my house, his eyes taking in the scene. I walked around the side of my house and down the driveway to meet them. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked with a measured pace. "A good afternoon, Chief," I said, extending a hand. "Arthur Jennings. I believe the reason you are here." He shook my hand. His grip was firm. "Chief Miller. We received a call about an unpermitted, hazardous, open-flame structure at this address." His eyes flicked over to Carol, who was now marching across the street toward us, her red binder of doom once again in hand. "Avada's right, Chief," she called out, her voice loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association, and this man has been operating this illegal fire pit for weeks. It is a clear and present danger to the community. The smoke is toxic and is right next to the woods. We are terrified of a wildfire." Chief Miller turned his head slowly to look at her. He didn't say a word. He just held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to me. "Sir, would you mind showing me the structure in question?" "Not at all," I said. "It's in the back. And for the record, it's not in operation today." I led the way up my driveway and along the gravel path. Carol and her entourage followed a few paces behind, whispering among themselves. She was performing for her audience, casting herself as the brave community protector. We rounded the corner of the workshop, and the smokehouse came into view. The chief stopped and looked at it. He walked around it, his professional eye taking in the construction, the materials, the ventilation, the clearance from any other structures. He ran a hand along the cool cinder blocks. He examined the insulated steel chimney and the professional-grade spark arrestor on top. Carol, unable to stand the silence, burst out, "A shack, a homemade monstrosity." He could burn us all down in our beds. A chief miller turned to her. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is one of the better constructed private smokehouses I have seen in my 25 years of service. This is not a homemade monstrosity. He turned back to me. Do you have the permit for this, Mr. Jennings? I do, I said. I pulled a Ziploc bag from my back pocket. Inside was a folded set of documents. The final, signed-off county building permit. A copy of the original blueprints I had submitted, the specification sheets for the chimney and insulation, showing their fire resistance ratings, and the original, signed ARC approval form from 2018. I handed the bag to him. He took his time, unfolding each document and reading it carefully. Carol shifted her weight from foot to foot, her smug expression beginning to curdle into one of confusion. This wasn't it, going according to her script. The authority figure was supposed to validate her, to smite her enemy. He was not supposed to be reading. A permit 74/1138. The chief read aloud, looking from the paper to the smokehouse and back again. A final inspection passed, signed by County Inspector Dave Johnson. I know Dave, he's a stickler. If he signed off on this, AT's built to code, and then some AT. He folded the documents neatly and handed the bag back to me. Mr. Jennings, you are in full compliance. There is no fire hazard here. I apologize for the interruption to your Saturday. He then turned to face Carol. Her face was a brilliant shade of red. The chief said, and now his voice carried a distinct edge of disapproval. A filing of false report is a serious offense. We dispatched a full engine company to this scene based on your call, which described an immediate and active fire risk. That takes resources away from potential real emergencies. But the rules. She stammered, holding up her binder as if it were a holy text. HOA rules. It's a nuisance. Not allowed. The chief said, his gaze unwavering. A civil matter. It has nothing to do with the fire code. My job here is done. He gave her a final dismissive nod, then turned to me. He lowered his voice slightly. For what it is worth, Mr. Jennings. My father had a smoker just like this. Made the best brisket in 3 counties. He gave me a slight smile, a brief moment of camaraderie between 2 men who understood process and order. You have a good day. He and his firefighters walked back to the truck. The neighbors who had gathered began to melt away, sensing the shift in the power dynamic. There was no public shaming of Arthur Jennings. There was only the public rebuke of Carol. She stood frozen on the gravel path, her binder hanging limply at her side. The big red engine started up. Its horn gave 2 short, polite beeps, and it pulled away, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in its wake. Carol stared at me, her eyes filled with a venomous rage. The humiliation was total. It had been delivered, not by me, but by the very authority she had sought to weaponize. She didn't say a word. She just turned and fled back to the safety of her own home. She had no idea that this public defeat was only the beginning. She thought this was the end of the battle. In reality, it was just the end of the opening skirmish. The real campaign, the one fought on paper, was about to begin. The fire engine's visit was a turning point. It was not a victory in itself, but it was a signal. It showed the neighborhood that Carol's authority was not absolute. It demonstrated that her interpretation of the rules could be challenged, and in this case, proven utterly wrong by a higher, more legitimate power. The effect was almost immediate. That evening, as I was sitting on my back patio, I saw a hesitant figure at the edge of my lawn. It was Mrs. Gable, my next-door neighbor, a sweet, quiet woman in her late 70s who had lived in her house for 40 years. In one hand she clutched a small cassette tape recorder. Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I saw what happened today with the fire department. It was very brave of you. Come on in, Eleanor, I said, gesturing to the other chair. Wasn't bravery, it was just paperwork. Would you like some iced tea? She sat down, placing the old recorder on the table between us, as if it were a bomb. Shay's been after me for years, you know, she said, her hands trembling slightly. About my bird feeders. She says they attract rats, which is ridiculous. Then it was the wind chimes my late husband gave me. She called them a noise pollution. Last month, she sent me a violation notice because the paint on my front door was, and I quote, an unapproved shade of eggshell. She fines me $50, $100. I just pay it. It is easier. I don't want any trouble. I nodded. I had seen the notices. I had a file section dedicated to the Gable residence. I know, I said gently. Well. She took a deep breath, her resolve seeming to build. After my husband passed, I started recording the HOA meetings. Just for myself. My memory is not what it used to be, and I wanted to remember what was decided. I have a recording of the meeting from last year where she proposed a special assessment for the Crepe Myrtle Beautification Projecta. She pushed the recorder across the table. On this tape, Mr. Henderson, Robert, who was on the board at the time, specifically asked her if she had checked the county easements before planting. He warned her about it. I stared at the little cassette recorder. It was a relic from another time, but it held a piece of evidence that was utterly damning. What did she say? I asked. Mrs. Mrs. Stan. Gabelas' eyes met mine. She told him, and the entire board, that she had personally walked the property line with the county planner and had received verbal approval for the project. She said it was all taken care of, a direct, material misrepresentation to the board, a lie, recorded for posterity. This was more than just negligence, this was fraud. Carol hadn't just made a mistake. She had been warned, and she had lied to push her pet project through. Eleanor, I said, my voice low. This is incredibly important. Are you willing to let me make a copy of this? Willing to stand up with you at the next meeting and play it for the whole neighborhood, she said. And a strength I had never seen before shone in her eyes. I am tired of being afraid in my own home. You stood up to her. Now I will too. With a fearful ally had found her voice the next day. I received a discreet email from an anonymous address. The message was short. Juan, on the board. Or tired of her. I know about the missing ARC files. She keeps a second set of books in her house. Call me. The phone number belonged to David Chin, the youngest member of the board, a quiet accountant who I had always thought seemed uncomfortable with Carol's methods. I met David for coffee in a town 10 miles away. He was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. A bully, he said, stirring his latte with a frantic energy. She controls the agenda. She shouts down anyone who disagrees with her. She makes decisions unilaterally and then pressures us to ratify them. I only joined the board to help with the budget, but Ite turned into a nightmare. He confirmed that Carol personally managed all ARC applications. She had a habit of eluding paperwork for projects she didn't like, then denying they were ever submitted. My Smokehouse application, approved by her predecessor, was a thorn in her side, an example of a time she wasn't in control. She had likely removed it from the official binder herself, allowing her to claim it never existed. Shay's planning to ram through the fine and the lien against you at the next meeting. David warned me. Shay's framed it as a safety issue, and Shay's counting on nobody questioning her. Shay is going to make an example of you, I said. David looked at me confused. The more she does in public, the better the record will be. I told him about the easement, about the lie recorded on Mrs. Gable's tape. His eyes widened. He was an accountant. He understood liability. David, I said, all I need you to do is ensure that I am given 5 minutes to speak at the meeting under a new business. Can you do that? I can do more than that, he said, a new determination in his voice. I can make the motion to approve the lien myself. That will force a public vote and give you the floor to speak directly to the motion before we do. The disillusioned insider had just become a co-conspirator. The coalition was forming. The quiet, resentful majority was beginning to stir. My fight was no longer just my own. It had become a focal point for years of pent-up frustration. 2 days before the scheduled HOA meeting, Carol made her final desperate move. I came home from the grocery store to find a large, neon orange sticker plastered to my front door. It was an official notice of property. Leanna designed with intimidating fonts and threatening legal language. It cited a fine of $5,000 for ongoing hazardous violations and failure to comply with a cease and desist order. It was, of course, a completely fraudulent document. A lien can only be placed on a property after a court judgment, or, in the HOA's case, after a formal documented process of notices, hearings, and votes, none of which had happened. This was pure intimidation, a theatrical gesture meant to shame and frighten me into submission just before the public meeting. I carefully peeled the sticker off my door. It left a sticky, ugly residue. End quote. But the document itself was another perfect piece of evidence. It was a clear demonstration of her overreach, her disregard for due process. It was her signature on a confession of harassment. I took a high-resolution photograph of the sticker on the door, then a photograph of the sticker itself, next to that day's newspaper, to date it. I placed the sticker into a clear evidence bag. I kept the receipts. This one was a gift. She had no idea. She had just handed me the capstone from my presentation. The final, irrefutable proof of her malice. The stage was now set. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room with fluorescent lighting and a faint smell of chlorine from the nearby pool. The air was thick with tension. The room was more crowded than I had ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Usually only a dozen or so residents would show up. Tonight there were at least 50. Carola's supporters, a tight-knit group of about 10, sat in the front rows, looking smug and expectant. The rest of the residents were scattered throughout the room, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and, in a few cases, quiet support. Mrs. Gable sat in the second row, clutching her purse with the cassette player inside. David Jen sat at the board table, his face a neutral mask. Carol, seated at the head of the table, beamed. She loved an audience. She called the meeting to order, her voice ringing with self-importance. They worked through the mundane business of the agenda: the treasurer's report, the landscaping committee, update. Then she arrived at the main event. Under new business, she announced, her voice dropping into a somber, serious tone. The board must address a grave safety concern affecting the entire community. The unpermitted, hazardous structure at 912 Willow Creek Lane A. She launched into a rehearsed emotional speech. She painted a terrifying picture of fire and destruction, of acrid smoke choking children, and property values plummeting. She spoke of her sleepless nights worrying for the safety of her neighbors. She portrayed me as a reckless, selfish scofflaw who cared nothing for the rules or the well-being of the community. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. A few of her supporters nodded gravely, clucking their tongues in sympathy. Therefore, she concluded, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, the board has been left with no choice but to levy a significant fine and place a lien on the property to compel compliance. David, would you make the motion? David cleared his throat. Madam President, he said, his voice steady. A move to approve a fine of $5,000 and the filing of a property lien against the property at 912 Willow Creek Lane for the hazardous structure in the backyard. A. Is there a second? Carol asked, scanning the board. Another board member, a woman who always voted with Carol, seconded the motion. Excellent, Carol said with a satisfied smile. The motion is on the floor. Is there any discussion before we vote? She was about to slam the gavel down when David spoke up again. Actually, Madam President, according to our bylaws, the homeowner in question has the right to be heard before a vote of this nature. I believe Mr. Jennings is here, and would like to address the board. A low murmur went through the crowd. Carola's smile tightened. She had clearly intended to allow no such thing. But David had invoked the process, the very thing she claimed to champion. She had no choice. "Oh, very well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The homeowner may have 3 minutes." I stood up and walked to the small lectern at the front of the room. I wasn't carrying a binder. I had a single, slim file folder. I opened it and placed a small stack of papers on the lectern. I didn't look at Carol. I addressed the room. "A good evening," I began, my voice calm and measured. My name is Arthur Jennings. I live at 912 Willow Creek Lane. I am a retired civil engineer with 40 years of experience in municipal planning and zoning. I would like to address the motion on the floor by presenting a few documents for the record. I started methodically. First, I said, holding up a document in a plastic sleeve. This is the county-approved building permit for my smokehouse. Permit 74, B 1138. As you can see, the final inspection was passed and signed on May 17, 2018. I continued, my voice never rising. Second, this is the official approval for the structure from the Lakeshore Point Architectural Review Committee, dated April 5, 2018, and signed by the late Mr. Henderson, the chairman at the time. Any claim that this structure is unapproved is factually incorrect. I paused, letting that sink in. I could see some of the residents shifting in their seats, looking at Carol with questioning eyes. Third, I said, holding up another paper. This is a copy of the official report from Fire Chief Miller, who was called to my home last Saturday by Mr.'s President. The report concludes, and I quote, "The structure is well built, meets or exceeds all fire safety codes, and constitutes no fire hazard whatsoever." The report also notes that the initial call was a misuse of emergency services. Carola's face had gone from smug to stony. Her mask was beginning to crack. Now, regarding the matter of rules, I went on, I would like to discuss the concept of easements. I held up a large color-coded map. It was a copy of the original 1988 subdivision plat map. This red line indicates a 10-foot public utility and drainage easement that runs along the back of every property on our side of the street. It is a county right-of-way. It cannot be obstructed. As you can see, my smokehouse, here, is located 3 feet inside my property line, leaving the easement completely clear. Then, I pointed to another area on the map. These green circles, however, which represent the crepe myrtle trees from the HOA's 5-year-old beautification project, are planted directly in the center of the county's easement. This is a significant and ongoing zoning violation by the HOA itself, which could result in thousands of dollars in fines and remediation costs to be paid by all of us. The room was now dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Carola's face was ashen. But this is the most troubling part," I said, my voice becoming firm. "Some of you may have been told that this was a simple mistake. It was not." I nodded to Mrs. Gable. She stood up, opened her purse, and pressed the play button on her small cassette recorder. The tinny, slightly distorted voice of Carol filled the room. Robert, I personally walked the line with the county planner. It is fine. We have verbal approval. It's all taken care of. The lie hung in the air, undeniable and ugly. Robert Henderson, Jr., who was in the audience, stood up. She told me that. She lied to my face. She lied to the whole board. This was the moment, the turning point, the collapse. Carol stared blankly ahead, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Her face, which had been a mask of confident authority, was now just the face of a woman who had been caught. The mask had not just slipped, it had shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at her supporters in the front row, but they were staring at the floor, at the map. Anywhere but at her. I held up my final piece of evidence. The neon orange sticker. And finally, I said, this fraudulent and intimidating notice of a property lien was placed on my front door 2 days ago. It is a document with no legal standing, designed solely to harass and intimidate a resident. It is in itself a violation of the HOA's own rules regarding neighborly conduct. I looked at the board members, at David, who was watching Carol with a look of profound disappointment. Khalif, I said, concluding my presentation, that this motion is not about safety. It is about a personal vendetta, and I believe the evidence shows that the only party here who has consistently and knowingly violated the rules, the county ordinances, and the trust of this community is the president herself. I placed my papers back in my folder and returned to my seat next to a beaming Mrs. Parmas. Gable. The silence in the room was broken as David Chen cleared his throat. Madam President, he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. I would like to withdraw my motion to fine Mr. Jennings. He then turned to the rest of the board. Instead, I would like to make a new motion. A motion of no confidence in President Carol, and a call for her immediate resignation. The room erupted. The spell was broken. Years of resentment came pouring out. For the next hour, person after person stood up to voice their own stories of Carola's bullying, of her arbitrary fines, and her selective enforcement. Her supporters sat in stunned silence, their champion utterly dismantled by a quiet man with a folder full of paper. The vote of no confidence was nearly unanimous. Carol sat through it all motionless, a statue of disgraced authority. When the meeting was finally adjourned, she walked out of the room alone, without a single person looking her way. She had no idea how thoroughly a person could be undone, not by shouting, but by the quiet, relentless weight of documented truth. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Carol submitted her resignation via email the next morning. Effective immediately, her husband put their house on the market within the week. They were gone in less than a month, disappearing from the neighborhood as quickly and completely as a phantom. There was no grand confrontation, no final, tearful apology. She simply vanished, her reign of petty tyranny ending not with a bang, but with the quiet tap of a for sale sign being hammered into her perfect lawn. David Chen was elected the new HOA president at an emergency meeting. His first act was to commission a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances and records from the past 6 years. The findings were predictable, but still shocking. The audit revealed that Carol had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal landscaping, had waived fines for her friends while aggressively pursuing them for others, and had kept 2 sets of financial records for the board and a private one on her home computer that detailed the true, sorry state of the association's reserve funds. The second set of books David had mentioned was real. He turned the evidence over to the district attorney's office. I do not know the full extent of the legal consequences for her, but I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband had to pay a substantial restitution to the HOA as part of a settlement to avoid criminal prosecution. The board, under DeVita's leadership, began the slow process of healing the community. They rescinded every fine Carol had issued in the past 2 years that couldn't be substantiated by a clear, written rule in the original covenants. Dozens of residents, including Mrs. Gable, received refund checks in the mail. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. It was a tangible admission that the previous administration had been wrong. The ridiculous beige trash can rule was abolished. The ARC process was reformed to be transparent, with all applications and decisions posted on a new community website. The biggest challenge was the crepe myrtle situation. The board consulted with the county and a civil engineering firm on mine, as I politely declined to be involved, citing a conflict of interest. The verdict was clear: the trees and the sprinkler system had to be removed from the public easement. It was a costly project, but David presented it to the community with honesty and transparency, explaining that it was necessary to correct a past mistake and avoid potentially massive fines from the county. He used the money recovered from Carol to offset a large portion of the cost. No one was happy about the expense, but for the first time in years, the residents trusted the board. The special assessment passed with a wide margin. My own life returned to a state of quiet normalcy, but with a few welcome changes. I was no longer just the quiet widower at the end of the cul-de-sac. I was Arthur, the man who had stood up to Carol. Neighbors who had previously only offered a polite wave now stopped to chat when I was out gardening. Mrs. Gable and I became firm friends, often sharing a glass of iced tea on my patio in the evenings. Her wind chimes, which she had taken down out of fear, now tinkled merrily in the breeze. The sound was lovely. About a month after the meeting, on a perfect Saturday afternoon, I had the smoker going again. A pair of briskets this time, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, slowly working their way toward perfection over post oak. As I was getting ready to wrap them, familiar county vehicle pulled up to my curb. It was Chief Miller. He got out of his SUV. Not in uniform this time, but in a polo, shirt and jeans. He was carrying a 6-pack of craft beer. I was driving by and thought I smelled something that required a professional opinion, he said with a grin. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Chief. I laughed. You're just in time. Give me about 2 more hours. He sat with me on the patio and we talked for those 2 hours. We talked about barbecue, about fishing, about our respective careers, built on rules and processes. He told me that calls like the one Carol had made were the bane of his departmente's existence, frivolous, vindictive complaints disguised as safety concerns. He said my calm, documented response that day had been a textbook example of how to handle it. When the brisket was finally ready, rested, and sliced, I piled a plate high for him. He took one bite, his eyes closing in appreciation. Mr. Jennings, he said, after a long, satisfying chew, this is not a fire hazard. This is a public service. We sat there. 2 men who understood the value of doing things the right way, sharing a meal that was the result of a long, patient process. It was a quiet, perfect moment of victory. Not a gloating victory, but a deep, satisfying sense of order restored. In the end, it was never really about the smokehouse. The smokehouse was just the ground. The conflict was about the nature of rules and the meaning of community. Carol believed rules were a weapon, a tool to enforce her will and elevate her status. She wielded them to create a community based on fear and arbitrary compliance. But that is not what rules are for. I have spent my life with rules of the laws of physics that hold up a bridge. the zoning codes that keep a neighborhood functional, the covenants that are supposed to ensure a peaceful coexistence. They are not meant to be instruments of tyranny. They are the foundation of fairness, the blueprint for order. They are supposed to protect the Mrs. Gables of the world from the Carrolls. When they are perverted, the entire structure becomes unsound. I still have the files. The two thick accordion binders sit on the bottom shelf of my office bookshelf. I don't look at them, but I keep them. A record of a time when the structure of our small community cracked and had to be repaired. Sometimes when the smoke is curling just right from the chimney of my little block and wood building, I think about what it means to truly own something. It is not just about the deed in a safe deposit box or the name on a tax bill. It is about the quiet, earned right to be left alone. It is about the peace that comes from knowing you are on solid ground, that you've done the work, followed the process, and have the documents to prove it. My home is more peaceful now than it has been in years. The air is clearer. And the brisket, I have to say, has never been better. Ending.